Hello, welcome to lesson 13.6B. I've entitled this video, The New Deal. This video is going to cover pages 823 to 827. How did FDR fight the Depression? During his campaign for the presidency, Roosevelt had sought advice on how to fight the Depression. He turned to a number of college professors who were experts on economic issues. These experts, nicknamed the Brain Trust, helped Roosevelt to plan bold, new programs. Question number one, what role did the Brain Trust have for President Roosevelt? They gave him advice on how to fix the problems that caused the Great Depression. Once in office, President Roosevelt chose able advisors. Harold Ickes, a Republican reformer from Chicago, became Secretary of the Interior. The president named social worker Frances Perkins the Secretary of Labor. Perkins was the first woman to hold a cabinet position. Question number two, why was Frances Perkins being named to be FDR's Secretary of Labor a big deal? Well, it was a big deal because this was the first woman to be a member of the president's cabinet. The new president moved forward on many fronts. He urged his staff to, quote, take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it and try another. But above all, try something. Question number three, what message did FDR send to his staff? He told them, I don't want to sit idly by and just let things happen. I want us to think of new ideas and try them. If they don't work, throw those out and we'll try something else. But we're going to be a presidency of action, not of sitting back and just letting things happen. The complete opposite of laissez-faire government. Strengthening banks. Roosevelt's first challenge was the nation's crumbling banking system. Many banks had closed. Fearful depositors had withdrawn their savings from other banks. People hid their money under mattresses or buried it in their yards. Question number four. What was the first challenge that FDR took on to solve the nation's economic problems? Fixing the banks. Number five, why were people hiding their money in their mattresses or burying their money in their yards? Because they didn't trust the banks. They had heard the stories of banks closing and your money disappearing just like that. The president knew he had to stabilize the banking system. Without sound banks, the economy could not recover. On his second day in office, he declared a bank holiday. He closed every bank in the country for 4 days. He then asked Congress to pass the Emergency Banking Relief Act. Under this act, only those banks with enough funds to meet depositors' demands could reopen. Others had to stay closed. Question number six, what was the bank holiday? The bank holiday was FDR saying, banks, you are not allowed to be open for 4 days until we can get this mess solved, and you can only reopen if you have enough money to do your job. Number seven, what did the Emergency Banking Relief Act do? It made sure that only the banks that had enough money could actually reopen after the bank holiday. A week after taking office, President Roosevelt spoke to Americans by radio. Under the new law, the president told the people, it is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under your mattress. The radio broadcast worked. Roosevelt explained things so clearly, said humorist Will Rogers, that even the bankers understood the situation. Reassured by the president, depositors returned their money to banks, and the banking system grew stronger. Question number eight, what communication method did FDR use to reassure Americans that the banks could be trusted again? He used the radio. Number nine, what effect did FDR's Emergency Banking Relief Act have on the banking system? It worked. He was able to restore confidence in the banks, and thus the banking system could grow stronger. Here is a political cartoon of FDR, and we'll talk about this political cartoon tomorrow. Feel free to pause the video if you'd like to see if you can figure out what's going on in this. Roosevelt gave 30 radio talks while in office. They became known as fireside chats. The president liked to imagine that his listeners were sitting around a fireplace with him. In fact, all across the nation, families gathered around their radios to listen to Roosevelt. Many believed the president understood their problems. Number 10, what were the fireside chats? These were the talks that President Roosevelt gave over the radio. He gave about 30 of them in his office, time in office, and he talked to the American people. He tried to lay out the problems that were before them, but he also then tried to tell them that in a confident way he had solutions or was working on solutions to their problems. He made them feel like he was a part of their family. He made them feel like they could trust him. He was a very effective communicator with the radio. And number 11, why were the fireside chats effective for FDR? Because unlike Hoover, who many people had perceived, his public perception was that he didn't care. FDR came across as someone who did care. Here's another political cartoon of FDR. Feel free to pause the video if you'd like to take this a little bit closer examination. We'll be talking about this political cartoon tomorrow. Laws for recovery. The bank bill was the first of many bills that Roosevelt sent to Congress during his first 3 months in office. Between March 9th and June 16, 1933, Congress passed a record 15 major new laws. Even the president admitted he was, quote, a bit shell-shocked by the 100 days, as this period was called. Question number 12. What occurred during the famous 100 days of FDR's presidency? Congress, with FDR's approval, passed 15 major new laws to change up what was going on during the Great Depression. The bills covered programs from job relief to planning for economic recovery. Together, they made up Roosevelt's New Deal. The New Deal laid out 3 main goals: relief for the jobless, plans for economic recovery, and reforms to prevent another depression. So a way to look at this is, and we call these the 3 R's, by the way: relief, recovery, reform. Think about this as far as the time frame. So relief programs were meant to help people right now. Notice, immediate help for the hungry and the jobless. They can't wait 3 years to get food or a job. They need the help now. They need the relief now. So this was a short-term set of programs. Recovery were more of your midterm programs. In other words, they might take up to a year or 2 years. The idea of the recovery programs was to get America out of the Great Depression. And then the long-term plans, or the reform programs, those were meant to be long-reaching, maybe even until like more recent times, which some of them have actually stayed around. These were plans and programs put in place to make sure that another Great Depression never happened again. So short-term, mid-term, and long-term programs: relief, recovery, and reform. And those are your answers for question 13, the 3 R's: relief, recovery, reform. Here's another political cartoon of FDR. Feel free to study it at this time. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Early relief programs. Programs for the now. In 1933, when Roosevelt took office, 13 million Americans were out of work. The president asked Congress for a variety of programs to help the jobless. Among the earliest New Deal programs was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. You'll start to realize there are a lot of acronyms used in the New Deal. This one's called the CCC. The CCC hired unemployed single men between the ages of 18 and 25. For $1 a day, they planted trees, built bridges, worked on flood control projects, and developed new parks. Number 14, describe the Civilian Conservation Corps, or CCC. Well, this program, first of all, focused on unemployed single men between the ages of 18 and 25. This program paid them to do things that helped our conservation efforts in our country, like planting trees, building bridges, working on flood control, and making parks. So this served a variety of purposes. Number 1, it gave a young man a job. Hopefully that would then give them confidence, and also these jobs were doing things that were helping American society. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, gave federal money to state and local agencies, which distributed it to the unemployed. So, for question 15, describe the Federal Emergency Relief Administration. This was basically the federal government saying, here states, here's some money. We believe that you know the best way to get this money to the people that are employed to help them get through this crisis. So once again, both these programs are relief programs. They're not going to be, permanent programs that are going to keep America out of another Great Depression, but it was giving people help and assistance at that particular time right then. The WPA. The Works Progress Administration, WPA, came into existence in 1935. The WPA put the jobless to work, making clothes and building hospitals, schools, parks, playgrounds, and airports. The WPA also hired artists, photographers, actors, writers, and composers. Artists painted murals on public buildings. WPA writers collected information about American life, folklore, and traditions. Some WPA writers interviewed African Americans who lived under slavery. Today, scholars still use these interviews to learn firsthand about slave life. Critics accuse the WPA of creating, quote, make-work projects that did little to benefit the nation in the long run. People don't eat in the long run, replied a New Dealer. They eat every day. So question number 16, describe the WPA. Well, once again, it was a relief program to get people jobs that could get them money and confidence. It gave the jobless things to do, such as making clothes, building hospitals, schools, parks, playgrounds, and airports, and also hired artist types of people to do like photography, acting, writing, composing, painting murals, interviewing people about their lives, folklore, and tradition. Number 17, what was the biggest criticism of the WPA? Well, people said, hey, this WPA is not going to give us the recovery, the reform that we need. And then, of course, the critics to the critics would say, well, who cares about the long term? If people are starving right now, they need food, and the way to get that is to get them a job right now. Making economic reforms. So now we're going on to the second programs, the recovery programs. To bring about recovery, the president had to boost both industry and farming. He developed programs that greatly expanded the government's role in the economy. With these and other programs, he hoped to prevent another depression. Regulating industry. Overproduction and declining prices had been a major cause of the Depression. Low prices during the Depression had caused businesses to fail and created widespread unemployment. Aiming to boost the economy, new dealers drew up plans to control production, stabilize prices, and keep workers on the job. A key new law was the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA. Under this law, each industry wrote a code or set of rules and standards for production, wages, prices, and working conditions. The NIRA tried to end price cutting and worker layoffs. So now question 18. Describe the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA. Their job was basically trying to help the economy in the area of our factories by controlling production, stabilizing prices, and keeping workers on the job. So they wrote a bunch of standards or rules to make sure that production, wages, prices, and working conditions were not being greatly affected. They were trying to end price cutting and worker layoffs. To enforce the new codes, Congress set up the National Recovery Administration, or NRA, not to be confused with the National Rifle Association. Companies that followed the NRA code stamped a blue eagle on their products. The government encouraged people to do business only with companies displaying the NRA eagle. The NRA soon ran into trouble, however. Many companies ignored the codes. Also, small businesses believed that the codes favored the bigger firms. So question 19, describe the NRA. This was part of the NIRA, and basically what they did was they said, hey, we're going to stamp things with this blue eagle, and what that means is this business is following our set of codes. However, number 20, the two criticisms of the NRA. Number 1, many companies took the eagle and put it on their window, but then were not following the codes. And also, small businesses believed that the codes actually favored the bigger companies. Here's another political cartoon. We'll talk about that tomorrow. Feel free to pause the video if you want to take a closer look. The NIRA also set up the Public Works Administration, or PWA. It promoted recovery by hiring workers for thousands of public works projects. PWA workers built projects such as the Grand Coulee Dam in Washington, public schools in Los Angeles, 2 aircraft carriers for the Navy, and a deep water port in Brownsville, Texas. Despite these efforts, the PWA did little to bring about recovery. Question 21. Describe the Public Works Administration. Well, it was trying to promote recovery by hiring thousands of workers to do public works projects such as building dams, schools, aircraft carriers, and a deep water port. Question number 22. What was the biggest criticism of the PWA? It did not bring about the recovery that had been hoped. Subsidizing farmers. On farms, overproduction remained the main problem. Surpluses kept prices and farmers' incomes low. A surplus occurs when farmers produce more than they can sell. Question 23. What was the main problem facing the farmers? The overproduction had kept the prices of goods low, therefore their incomes were also low. And you can see that by this chart here that shows you the prices of food in 1912, 1913, and then you look at the prices at the start of the Great Depression, and you can see that prices in most charts here have been cut by at least half. That's not a way to make a lot of money. Number 24, surplus is when you have more than you can sell. 25, it doesn't seem like it'd be a problem, but why would surpluses and overproduction hurt individual farmers? Well, for consumers, you love cheap food, But for the farmers, if the food is so cheap they can't make a profit, then farmers can't stay in business. They lose their farm, the farm gets foreclosed on, and you don't have people making food. So it's a very challenging problem. And it's one that FDR tried to tackle with the AAA. To help farmers, the President asked Congress to pass the Agricultural Adjustment Act, AAA. Under the AAA, the government paid farmers not to grow certain crops. Roosevelt hoped this action would help increase prices. The government also paid farmers to plow surplus crops under the soil and to destroy surplus cows and pigs. Many Americans were outraged that crops and livestock were being destroyed and people in the cities were going hungry. Yet, the plan seemed necessary to help farmers recover and keep them growing food. Yeah, this was definitely one of the most controversial programs that FDR proposed. Number 26, describe the AAA. Well, it realized the way to help farmers was to get the farm prices to go up. Now, how they were going to do that was twofold. Number one, they did pay farmers not to grow certain crops. They said, don't grow these and we'll pay you. The idea being to reduce the surpluses. And secondly, and this is the part that was very controversial, surplus food was destroyed. I mean, 6 million hogs were killed. Think about that. Here there are people in the cities who are scraping by with Hoover stew, and they hear these stories of 6 million hogs being slaughtered and not sold for food. Definitely a controversial program, which is number 27. The biggest criticism were that people in the big cities were starving, and here were these farmers destroying their crops. You can understand how that would be very frustrating. Here's a line graph to show you a concept of how many banks foreclosed. So definitely that tells you something about the ability of the bank holiday and the Federal Emergency Relief Act to how that fixed the banking situation. And then you can see the farm foreclosures. And when FDR put in the AAA, you can see what happened there. And we'll talk about that tomorrow as well. Here's another political cartoon that we'll talk about tomorrow. Feel free at this point to pause the video if you want to take a closer look at this political cartoon. The Rural Electrification Administration, or REA, was created to help people in rural areas get the same electrical service as people in urban areas. The REA provided money to extend electrical lines to rural areas. As a result, the number of farms with electricity rose from 10% to 25%. Electricity helped save many farms from ruin. For example, with refrigeration, dairy farmers did not have to worry about milk going sour before it could be sent to market. Question 28, describe the Rural Electrification Administration. Well, very simply put, their goal was to extend electrical service to people in urban areas and to rural areas. Rural areas. People already had the electrical service in urban areas. The people in the rural areas, the farming areas, needed the electricity for things, well, for basic needs, but also for things like refrigeration. And so the REA was able to get electricity, people with farms, to go from 10% to 25%. So this was a tremendous success. However, there was another program that was even bolder than the REA, and that was the TVA. Perhaps the boldest program of the 100 Days was the Tennessee Valley Authority, or TVA. It set out to remake the Tennessee Valley area, pictured here. This vast region often suffered from terrible floods. Because the farmland was so poor, more than half the region's families were on relief. The TVA was a daring experiment in regional planning. To control flooding, TVA engineers built 49 dams in 7 states. The dams also produced cheap electrical power. In addition to building dams, the TVA deepened river channels for shipping. It planted new forests to conserve soil and developed new fertilizers to improve farmland. The agency also set up schools and health centers. So question 29, describe the Tennessee Valley Authority. Well, this was a huge program, and basically the reason they targeted this area was that you had over half the peoples living in that land were on relief. And so if you could take them off relief, then they're not taking that money, and that money can be used in other places. So the idea was to get these people out of their poverty. And the biggest problem was all the flooding. So basically, as this picture shows, they took lemons and made lemonade. They took all the flooding, and what they did was they built dams that then harnessed all that water energy into making hydroelectrical power, which then you could now have cheap electrical power for the region. You'd have less flooding, And now these people can actually turn their part of the country around and not be on relief. A very bold program. The TVA sparked a furious debate. Critics argued that the government had no right to take business away from private companies in the region. Power companies in the Tennessee River Valley were especially outraged. They pointed out that the government, which did not have to make a profit for shareholders, could supply electrical power more cheaply than a private company could. Having to compete with the government, they said, might force them out of business. Supporters replied that the TVA showed how the government could use its resources to help private enterprise. In the end, the program helped transform a region of desperate poverty into a prosperous and productive area. Uncle Sam flexing his muscle. So question number 30, what was the biggest criticism of the TVA? Well, it was from many people that were private companies that gave power in the region were like, hey, we can't compete with the federal government. I mean, that's something we can't do. And you are overstretching your power. 31, what arguments were used by those that supported the TVA? Well, they said, hey, complain all you want, but we took a region that had over half the people on relief, and we've turned things around. Now, instead of having constant flooding, they're now getting cheap electricity. We turned a bad situation and turned it into a good situation. So complain all you want, but we did the right thing. And it's still debated today what role the federal government has in the lives of the American people and how far is too far, how much is too much power. It's still a debate that we have a healthy discussion on today. Well, thank you for watching. I couldn't really find a cartoon or a joke to fit into today's thought, so I just went with a Far Side cartoon that I really enjoy. No, I'm not your little dog Fifi. I'm the chicken you thought you fixed for dinner. Would you like to know where your little Fifi is? Ha 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 ha. Thank you and have a nice day.